gentlemen, here is the former IBF Junior Middleweight World Champion and the current hard-hitting, undefeated, reigning and defending WBC Middleweight Champion of the World, introducing Jermall Hitman Charlo.
So tell us, man, what's this all about, man? Who's the next guy you planning on fighting? I was at your last fight, man. This guy, the guy didn't come and killed him, man. He went there to make a payday.
No, la verdad es que tenía que enfrentarlo para hacer la meta que tenemos, que es unificar en las 168 libras, pero tenemos esta pelea en mayo que es con Billy Joe Saunders, un gran peleador, y pues seguir colectando los cinturones en las 168 libras.
Yeah, he said it was a mandatory fight for him, and then now he's up to bigger. He's going to move up to 168 pounds and beat up with Saunders, and he's looking to just collect more belts and more gold to his resume.
Dontaesboxingnation, what's going on, guys? So you heard that little clip I just played with Canelo Alvarez doing an interview with Mike Tyson on his show. And I'm going to play a couple other clips, but before I do, I want to go ahead and respond to what you just heard Canelo Alvarez say in that piece right there. You heard Mike Tyson say to Canelo Alvarez, the last guy you just fought, he didn't come to fight. He just came for a payday. And Canelo Alvarez explains, well, I had to fight him because he was my mandatory. And guys, this is the reason why being inconsistent with what you do in your boxing career, it comes back to haunt you and forces you to contradict yourself like it just did to Canelo Alvarez. Because Canelo Alvarez vacated his belt when Jermall Charlo was his mandatory at 160. He was his mandatory for almost 2 years. All of a sudden, he moves up to 168. And something else he didn't tell Mike Tyson was he requested to fight Avni Yildirim when he first decided that he was going to move up to 168. And I'm going to tell you, it kind of comes off like Mike Tyson is a little intimidated with Canelo Alvarez and Canelo Alvarez supporters while he's doing this interview. I mean, because Mike Tyson, he had Canelo Alvarez sitting next to him all this time, and he never asked Canelo Alvarez to fight Jermall Charlo on the show. Instead, Mike Tyson, he did another interview with someone else. I believe it was Fight Hype. And on that interview, he said, I want to see Canelo Alvarez fight against Jermall Charlo. Now, right after he said that, and this is once again what I mean when I say I feel like he doesn't want to offend a lot of the racist fans, if you know what I'm talking about, because right after he said that, he said, but I'm sure Canelo has too much power for Jermall Charlo, but I really want to see that fight. You know, it's kind of like playing it safe. Like, okay, just in case fans get angry that I even said I want to see this fight, let me try to balance it out by saying, hey, but I still think Canelo, he has a shot, or he's the favorite to win the fight. But just listen to some more questions that Mike Tyson, he asked Canelo Alvarez. Check this out.
The big son is one of the champions.
Yes, es campeón, no?
Yeah, he's a champion for the WBO.
Yes, he's
Cool.
from
So who's
from
going to be
England.
around the beach and no one can, what is just going to be hanging out? Who you going to fight? You move up to 78, 75?
No, it's difficult to go too much way up. It's difficult for
What
me.
about 60? Will you fight at 60?
168?
Only 68?
168 is my way now, and I feel good. I feel in my best moment, so I feel like anybody can beat me right now.
Now, so who do you got to fight out there? Who do you want to fight?
Anybody.
You don't have nobody on the list?
I'm just gonna fight the best fighter out there.
Who's that?
I'm gonna fight with Billy Joe Saunders. He's one of the best in 168.
Yeah,
I just fought in December, and last December I fought with the number one in 168. I beat him, and then I'm going forward.
Now, you guys remember when Mike Tyson interviewed Teofimo Lopez and Ryan Garcia. Mike Tyson told Teo, I want you to fight Devin Haney. And Teo, he said, we are going to fight. But then he started saying, I'm going to most likely fight Kambosos next. And Mike Tyson was like, no, you need to fight Devin Haney. Devin Haney should be next. And that's when T.O. start lying and saying, yeah, he will be next, right? When Mike Tyson interviewed Ryan Garcia, he said, man, let's make the Ryan Garcia versus Tank Davis fight. But notice Mike Tyson has to ask Canelo who's the best because none of those guys stand out. There is no type of Tank Davises, no Ryan Garcias, no Teofimo Lopez's in Canelo Alvarez's division. And that's the reason why Mike Tyson was like, who's the best? Who are you going to fight? Right? And this is the reason also why Mike Tyson later on said, I want to see Canelo fight Jermall Charlo, because that's a real fight, that's something he did say. Although once again, he tried to butter it up by saying that Canelo Alvarez, is most likely going to win the fight, but that would be a really, really tough fight. So he's not saying that when it comes to the fighters at 168, because even a casual fan like Mike Tyson knows there are no A-level champions at 168. And Mike Tyson, he wants what all real boxing fans want. Mike Tyson wants to see these guys in 50-50 type fights. We all know Canelo versus Benavidez, Canelo versus Andrade, Canelo versus Jermall Charlo, or Canelo versus any of the top guys at 175. Those would all be considered 50-50 fights. Mike Tyson is trying to play it cool and be nice, but he knows that Canelo Alvarez is not fighting anyone elite right now at 168, which is the reason why Canelo Alvarez wants to unify at 168 and did not want to unify at 154 and 160 when the champions were the Charlo brothers and Demetrius Andrade. So even though I believe Mike Tyson dropped the ball when he didn't ask Canelo Alvarez to his face, why don't you fight Charlo? Just like he said to Teofimo Lopez, just like he said to Ryan Garcia, he should have done this. He should have did the same thing when it comes to Canelo Alvarez. But once again, he did mention it after this interview in another interview. And that does add more names to that long list of fighters who have all said the same thing. We heard Oscar De La Hoya say almost 2 years ago, if Canelo wants to be considered a great, he has to fight the likes of a Demetrius Andrade and a Jermall Charlo. We heard Bernard Hopkins. When Bernard Hopkins was asked, is Canelo Alvarez one of the greatest Mexican fighters, et cetera, and Bernard Hopkins said, not yet. He has to fight like a Jermall Charlo. He beat someone like that, then you can consider him one of the greats, right? We've heard Marcos Maidana say Canelo needs to fight Jermall Charlo. Now we're hearing Mike Tyson say it. And there's been plenty of Mexican, legends and champions. They've also said the same thing. And if they didn't say, and if some of them didn't say they wanted him to fight Charlo, they just criticized him, like Eric Morales, for example, criticized Canelo Alvarez for always fighting guys that are faded towards the end of their career. But it's not only guys towards the end of their career that Canelo Alvarez fights. I'll give Canelo that. Canelo also enjoys fighting guys coming off of their worst performances, like Billy Joe Saunders and Caleb Smith. And while we're having this conversation, let me go ahead and respond to some of the Canelo Alvarez fans that were in my comment section from the last video I did, where Terrence Crawford said Canelo Alvarez, he shies away. His exact words was he shies away from black fighters because they give him the most problems. First of all, it is a fact that black fighters have given Canelo Alvarez the most problems. We could all agree with that, right? The only loss he has on his record is against a 36-year-old man that was almost 20 pounds smaller than him, Floyd Mayweather, right? Now, we already know, when I give you those stats, 36 years old, 15 to 20 pounds smaller than him, we all know right now that if Floyd Mayweather, if the roles were reversed, and Floyd Mayweather was the naturally bigger guy, Floyd Mayweather was 23. You guys remember what Floyd was doing at 23, right? By the time Floyd was 23, he had already annihilated Diego Corrales, Jenner Hernandez, Angel Manfredi. So this is the version of Floyd Mayweather that would have been fighting a 36-year-old Canelo Alvarez after Canelo had already moved up 5 weight classes. Then he's going to fight against Pretty Boy Floyd, who's going to outweigh him by 15 to 20 pounds. We all know you could be the most racist Canelo fan in the world, and even you know that Canelo Alvarez would almost have no chance of winning that fight. If he couldn't win when he had every single physical attribute, every single physical advantage over Floyd Mayweather, we know what time it is if the roles were reversed. So outside of Gennady Golovkin, not implying he would only have problems against black fighters, but without a doubt, the majority of fighters he had problems with were black fighters. Robert Garcia, who's a huge Canelo Alvarez fan, he said the Austin Trout fight could have went either way. We all know that a lot of people believe that Lara, he beat Canelo Alvarez in that fight. So these are all facts. So with the Canelo fans, they were trying to say, oh, well, Terrence Crawford, what is he talking about? You know, he's avoiding black fighters. He's not fighting black fighters. Terrence Crawford went after the former boogeyman in the division, in the sport, which was Errol Spence. At one point, Errol Spence was the boogeyman. Crawford has been calling out Errol Spence since Crawford was at 140. Why do you think Crawford went to Errol Spence's fight live? Crawford has been calling out Errol Spence for years now. If we're going to make an apples and apples comparison, since you guys tried to compare Canelo's situation to Crawford's, then let me ask you this question. When is the last time Canelo Alvarez attended a Charlo or an Andrade fight? Keep in mind, Andrade and the Charlo brothers have been calling out Canelo Alvarez for almost 7 years now. All the way from 154 to 168, they've been calling out Canelo. 6 to 7 years, Canelo has never attended a Charlo or an Andrade fight. But you know whose fight he did attend? He attended a Victor Ortiz versus Josito Lopez fight. Oh yeah, he watched that fight because Canelo was trying to get a fight with Victor Ortiz. Remember, Victor Ortiz fights at 140. At this point in time, Canelo fought at 154. So he attended that fight. Now, once again, you fans asked for this, so we're going to go ahead and compare Canelo to Crawford when it comes to going after the most elite black fighters in the game. Crawford has pulled up on Errol Spence with his camera, talking shit. Canelo Alvarez has never pulled up, confronted a Demetrius Andrade or Charlo. Now, has he? He's never called him out when Crawford has been calling out Errol Spence for years now. We all know, once again, even the diehard Canelo Alvarez fans, you know deep down in your heart, if Canelo was a welterweight right now, there's no way he would be calling out Errol Spence. There's no way he would be attending Errol Spence fights. The only time Canelo would be interested in fighting an Errol Spence or even a Terrence Crawford is if they have to move up 2 weight classes. And then I heard some Canelo fans saying Canelo, he fought more black fighters than Terrence Crawford. But it doesn't matter if you're fighting against black fighters that are not elite, if you're fighting against black journeymen, if you're fighting against black fighters that aren't even ranked in the top 10. Because there was a couple fans that had said, well, remember, Canelo, he did fight Austin Trout. The Austin Trout fight was almost, 9 years ago? It was 8 or 9 years ago. And that is the exact point right there. The last time Canelo Alvarez fought an undefeated black fighter, or the last 2 that he fought, was almost, 7 or 8 years ago, which was Austin Trout and Floyd Mayweather. Now, once again, this is not so much about Canelo has to go out and look for undefeated fighters that are not available. The point is, with Canelo Alvarez, he just happens to be in a position to where when he was at 154 and 160, all of the other black champions were undefeated. They don't have to be undefeated. My point is, they have to be elite. They have to be the biggest threats. We know that when Canelo fought Shane Mosley wasn't even ranked in the top 10 at the time. He was old and towards the end of his career, and he fought him on Floyd Mayweather's undercard. And Oscar De La Hoya told him, you have to knock out this version of Shane Mosley if you want to become a superstar. Because Oscar understood and knew that Shane Mosley was completely towards the end of his career. See, once again, this is the whole thing that I don't understand. I always see Mexican fans in the comment section saying Mexicans run boxing, Mexicans are the best, we run the sport, etc., etc. What doesn't make sense, if that's the case, if you truly believe that, the fans that say this, you guys should be pushing for Canelo to fight the most dangerous non-Mexican fighters, period. Whether it's Andrade, whether it's Charlo, or whoever else is on Andrade or Charlo's level. At 160, those are the most elite, right? At 168, a Mexican fighter is the most elite, which is David Benavidez. And I'm going to keep saying this. Canelo Alvarez, if he wants to really prove that he's gotten better since the Floyd Mayweather fight, why are you not fighting guys that have a similar style to Floyd Mayweather? That doesn't mean they have to be just as good as Floyd Mayweather. It just means they have to have a similar style. If Canelo went in there and completely dominated a Demetrius Andrade, a Jermall Charlo, that would definitely imply that he's gotten better since the Floyd Mayweather fight. But you can't claim you've gotten better if you have avoided anyone that fights like a Floyd or even an Adeslani Lara. I told you guys, Canelo Alvarez will only fight a black fighter if that guy has already been knocked out before, he's already got losses on his record, he's coming up in weight, or he's way towards the end of his career, like Shane Mosley was. Danny Jacobs is a perfect example. Just look at the trio you had at 160. You had Andrade, Charlo, and Danny Jacobs. Out of the three, there was only one guy who had been knocked out and had 2 losses on his record. You think it's a coincidence that's the only guy that Canelo decided to fight? And not the undefeated champions that had been calling out Canelo Alvarez for at least 4 or 5 years at that point? You could never compare Canelo Alvarez to Terrence Crawford. Not if we're talking facts. I mean, you could say whatever you want, but you cannot refute the actual facts. Terrence Crawford has fought every single fighter he's been accused of ducking. He was accused of ducking Victor Postal because at this point, I remember Mauricio Herrera, who was a really good fighter, Terrence Crawford was trying to make that fight. Mauricio Herrera was avoiding Terrence Crawford. So once Herrera started to avoid Crawford, that's when fans started to say, yeah, but why won't you fight Victor Postal? Fans were literally accusing Terrence Crawford of ducking Victor Postal. Because at the time, Victor Postal, he was undefeated, and he had just came off of a huge win, knocking out Lucas Matisse. Lucas Matisse at the time was one of the best fighters in the sport, definitely in the division. And let's not forget, this was a time when fans were starting to say, and old media were starting to say, that the Eastern European fighters are starting to take over the sport. This is when Terrence Crawford fought him. When they were accusing him of ducking this guy, he completely dominated him. He got accused of ducking Felix Diaz, another really, really good fighter, gold medalist for Colombia. A lot of people believe that he got robbed when he fought Lamont Peterson, right? So a lot of people considered him undefeated going into the fight with Terrence Crawford. Terrence Crawford stopped him. Every single fighter that they accused Crawford of ducking, he beat them impressively. Andrade and Charlo have been calling out Canelo Alvarez for 6 years. So why hasn't Canelo did the same thing that Terrence Crawford did? Why doesn't he go ahead and fight them and beat them impressively? It's never been about how many black fighters you have on your resume. It's about how many dangerous elite fighters that were champions in your division at the time were you willing to fight. I tell you guys this all the time. It would be entirely different if Canelo Alvarez had the type of heart that Terrence Crawford has, where it was Canelo going after Andrade and Charlo for 6 years, and they kept ducking him to where he finally got to the point where he says, man, they don't want to fight. I'm moving on. Because this is exactly what Terrence Crawford did with Errol Spence. He's been calling him out for years, and it's so funny because this is exactly what Errol Spence was doing with Keith Thurman. Spence kept calling out Keith Thurman for years and years and years, and the more Keith Thurman would mention Spence's name, the more he would contradict himself, the more ridiculous his demands would sound. It got to the point where eventually Errol Spence just said, you know what, I'm done talking about him. I don't want to fight him no more. I don't care about him. Don't ask me no questions about Keith Thurman. That's what Errol Spence ended up doing once he realized that Thurman doesn't want the fight. I might as well move on. And now here Crawford is doing the exact same thing with Errol Spence. I believe the final straw was when Crawford showed up at Errol Spence's fight. And Errol Spence, surprisingly, when he was asked in the post-press fight conference, the fact that Terrence Crawford, someone asked Errol Spence, the fact that Terrence Crawford showed up at your fight, is that an indication we're closer to getting this fight? And Errol Spence, he flat out said, nope. He didn't say maybe, depending on how business goes, we'll talk about that fight. He didn't talk about what the split would be. He didn't say, yeah, if the split is right. He didn't say any of that. He just flat out said no, right? Meaning he had no interest at that time in facing Terrence Crawford, right? I think this is what made Terrence Crawford come to the realization that he's not going to get this fight. And then there was also the other part in that press conference where Errol Spence, he said, I want Terrence Crawford to keep his word and keep my name out of his mouth. In other words, he was saying to Terrence Crawford, I want you to keep your word and stop wanting to fight me. It almost sounded like he was telling Terrence Crawford, just move on, man. Just let it go. And that's exactly what Errol Spence, he did. He completely let it go. You also heard Errol Spence say, I don't even know why he showed up. I wouldn't have never showed up at any of his fights. So after Errol Spence did all that, it's common sense that Terrence Crawford is going to leave it alone. He's going to move on. There's no reason for him to just keep going back and forth when Errol Spence has already made it clear that Terrence Crawford is not going to be his next fight. He's already made it very clear. But back to my original point. It would be different if Canelo Alvarez had been calling out Andrade and Charlo for years. And then he finally came to the conclusion he's not going to get those fights. So Canelo decides, you know what? If I can't get these big fights at 160 or 154, I'm moving up to 168. And then I'm going to unify all the belts there. See, if Canelo did it that way, no one could blame him for fighting weaker opposition at a higher weight class because he tried to make the most dangerous fights, but those opponents, they didn't want to fight against Canelo Alvarez, which is the same reason why you cannot blame Terrence Crawford on someone who doesn't want to fight him, someone who doesn't even want him to show up at their fights and try to possibly promote a future fight with him. At the end of the day, remember, guys, it was you that wanted to compare Canelo to Terrence Crawford. Apples and apples, right? Canelo has never had any champions calling him out for 5 to 6 years. I'm talking about champions that were fighting in Terrence Crawford's division. and Crawford avoided them. Moved up in weight, they moved up in weight. Crawford avoided them again, moved up to a higher weight class. This is what Canelo did. Crawford has never done this. Crawford has never vacated his title to avoid a dangerous black champion or any other dangerous champion. He has never vacated his belt to avoid a champion. Canelo has. These are all facts. None of this is just gossip boxing talk. I'm giving you the facts, the whole truth. If Canelo Alvarez was a savage, a beast, a warrior like Terrence Crawford, he would have went after Jermall Charlo, Demetrius Andrade, and every other fighter that people are saying he's afraid to fight, that people are saying would beat him. Real champions feel like, oh, if you guys are saying this guy's going to beat me, then that's the guy I want to fight next. That's the mark of a pound-for-pound king. I'm on to the next one, y'all. Fellas, I've got some great news for you. If you've lost your hair or have a receding hairline, the time has come when you can finally get your hairline back through a process called scalp micropigmentation. So here's how it works. It's a hair tattoo that replicates the look of your hair follicles when you have fully shaved it down. So to get this hookup, make sure you follow and contact my man ScalpCarolinas on Instagram. Now check this out, guys. If you're looking to repair eczema scars, burns and bruises, dark spots and blemishes, then this right here is the perfect product for you guys. It's called Elodiki Face and Body Oil. Athletes and top-ranking boxers, they're also using it after training to reduce swelling, inflammation, and to ease the pain. So get yours today. Go to elodiki.com, like them on Facebook, and follow them on Instagram.
Love that.